Okay, in this segment in chapter 21, we're going to be talking about economic versus accounting costs. I don't know how many of you are currently taking accounting, but if you look at an accountant's cost, they take into consideration what we call explicit costs. Explicit costs are resources that are paid explicitly. You paid cash for it. You paid a check for it. Something you write a check for is explicit. Economists will look at it in another way. They will use the explicit, but they also use what we call implicit, which is any factor of production that was not paid in an explicit wage. Things like time of the owner. We've talked over and over about a concept called opportunity cost. Your real cost of taking an economics class is the time you gave up in doing other things. Well, what we're talking about there is the implicit. What did you give up to do it? The explicit costs of taking an economics class are the book, the tuition that you paid, and any various fees. The implicit, however, is all the time that it takes. It makes up the big bulk of taking this class. So in this relationship, something that you'll need to remember is that economic costs are always greater than or equal to accounting costs. They will always be the greater bulk of things. Economic costs take into consideration alternatives, whereas accounting costs are things you pay for. If you look at a tree, for instance, the accountant will look at the value of the board feet, where the economist will look at that as well as any sentimental value, shade that it gives, beauty, things like that. So that's where we got to look at these. That's why there's some difference there. When you look at your cost of doing homework, there's no accounting cost for watching this tape. But there is a cost associated with it. It's the time you give up. You could have been doing something else. Going to work, sleeping, playing with the children, whatever it is. You gave up something to do this. So that's what we want to keep straight in this section. The last section of this chapter talks about economies of scale. Economies of scale basically means the bigger that you get, the cheaper you can produce something. And if we look at that, what is happening when we have economies of scale is that we're looking at an item that probably has high fixed costs. It's something that we typically will call capital intensive, meaning that it uses a higher ratio of machinery to people. If we have an item that's capital intensive, we can say that the more we produce, the less it will cost per unit. The reason for that is that capital intensive things tend to have a lot of fixed costs and smaller variable costs. The higher fixed cost is something you've already paid for. Once I've bought the machinery, I should run it as much as possible, because all the cost of purchasing was up front. Here we can look at something like the farming industry. If we look at it as you buy that $1 million combine out there, the more wheat you can do, the cheaper it becomes per unit. And that's what you're looking at. Under economies of scale, it's actually broken into 3 different categories. First is economies of scale. Tends to be capital intensive. Then we have diseconomies. Diseconomies of scale mean that the larger that you get, the less efficient you become. These typically will happen in human intensive production. I don't know what you guys do at work, but I know here the more people that get together, the more socializing that happens. Less productivity. What we're seeing here is the more human beings you put in one space, The more socializing they do, the less productive they become. So when we're looking at that long run, where we can make things any size we want, that's where this comes into play. If we have an industry that has economies of scale, you want to build one giant facility to produce for the entire market. If you have something that has diseconomies of scale, you would rather have several small units to produce. Because bigger is better or smaller is better, there's also a state called constant returns. And that basically means that the size of the operation does not affect its efficiency. It's an unlikely scenario. Most companies will go into one of these two. Either bigger is better or being smaller is better. If you typically look at the manufacturing type sector, economies of scale, because of their capital intensive, diseconomies in the human service industries, because they are human intensive. That concludes chapter 21. The keys for chapter 21 is to know the relationships between these different definitions. Chapter 21 is just a lot of definitions and concepts. The key to it is to be clear on what is what. Know what a marginal cost is. Know what an average total cost is. Know what this is. And once you know all those, then you have the ability to put them together and figure out issues. But keep them clear. Definitions matter here. Wording is very similar, and you need to be clear on that. Other than that, those are the major things that I see that students have problems with. Be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. Just feel free to email me. Thank you very much.